Welcome everybody to techUK Talks, How Will Data Drive Our Post-COVID-19 Recovery? My name is Sue Daley. For those of you who don't know me, I am Associate Director for Technology and Innovation at techUK, and it's my pleasure to be the chair of this panel discussion today. It's part of techUK Talks, a series of sessions we're holding during London Tech Week, and it's great to have you all with us. Before we move on to the topic of today, just to let you know, we've still got more techUK Talks panels coming up. Later on today, we're talking about digital ethics in 2020 and what we've learned so far. This is actually a great timing because today we're launching techUK's Digital Ethics Summit, which will be the 4th annual summit we've done coming up in December. So the key focus for us. And then later on this week, we'll be talking about public sector transformation, which I'm sure we might touch on today as well. Building up to our techUK Building the Smarter State event, which is on the 17th of September. So more to come. And all the panels that we've had during London Tech Week are being recorded, so you'll be able to go back and watch them later, including this one. But bringing it back to today, we're talking about the role data can play as an essential tool to helping public and private sector organizations understand and navigate the current, obviously, pandemic, but also on how we move forward and how we get the rebuilding, reinvention, recovery of our economy and society going, and the role data can play and the innovative data-driven tools and technologies that can really help us going forward. Now, it's a really perfect time and day to be having this discussion as the government have just released its national data strategy plans this morning, which is excellent to see a national strategy and vision coming together for how the UK can really realise the full potential and value of data, particularly as we look to rebuild and recover the economy from COVID-19. But it would be unfair of me to ask the panelists to talk about the strategy as it's only just dropped and it is rather big. But there are more details on our website about the strategy. And also, many of you may have seen it's a consultation, so we'll be looking forward to working with DCMS on how the strategy will move forward going forward. But it's definitely the topic of the day is definitely data and how do we get this right for the UK and what does it mean getting this right? What have we learned so far from where we've been and what do we need to do going forward? So we have a great panel of leading experts for you to listen to today, perhaps ask some questions. Please do feel free to ask some questions in the chat function. I have some really good questions to kick us off the discussion, but we'll try and weave them in as we go. But before we kick off, let's ask each of the panelists just to introduce themselves, where they come from and their role, and then we'll get going. So Sarah, can I ask you to just introduce yourself? And brilliant to have you with us. Thank you so much.
Well, thanks so much for inviting me, Sue. It's a really great pleasure. So Sarah Cameron, I'm a legal director at the law firm Pinsent Masons, and I work within the tech and digital markets sector team. So this is a very key area of focus for us, and I can't wait to read the National Data Strategy because I haven't seen it as yet.
Great, thanks, Sarah. Ben, it's just great to have you with us. Just introduce yourself for everybody, please.
Thank you, Sue. My name's Ben Bennett. I am the Director of High Performance Computing Strategy at Hewlett-Packard Enterprise. I work with public sectors and with government, and I look out at technologies and changes that are happening around 3 areas, which is data simulation, data analytics, and AI. And I do this, as I say, with government and large public funded bodies.
Great, brilliant to have you with us, Ben. So much experience and knowledge there, brilliant. Ian, great to have you with us also. Just explain yourself and explain yourself, that sounds awful. Just introduce yourself to everybody, please.
Thank you, Sue. Yeah, welcome everybody. So my name's Ian Wood. I work for a technology vendor called Veritas. We specialize in data management solutions. We've done that for about 3 decades. And my role at Veritas is around technical services and sales. I lead the group of technical services and sales in the UK and I.
Brilliant. And Haydn, welcome.
Yeah, thank you for the invitation. So my name is Haydn Jones. I'm a director at PwC. My principal focus at the moment is blockchain and distributed ledger technologies, although that does take me into areas such as fintech, obviously. I mean, I have a broader background, having worked at Fujitsu for 4 years, managing some of their big, large outsourcing accounts. And then prior to that, worked at the Bank of England, and then also what was the FSA. So seen lots of big, thorny data type problems in both a public sector and also private business context. So it's something which is very close to my heart, especially given that I'm an engineer. So it's great to be here.
Wow, such amazing experience. This is going to be a fascinating discussion, I can just tell. So thank you all for being here today. And obviously we're talking about how will data drive our post-COVID recovery, look at the role of data. But of course, it's also important not just to look at, well, what needs to happen next? What can data do in terms of how we move forward? And I'm sure we'll come to that. But I want to just perhaps touch on what we've learned so far, what we've seen during the COVID-19 pandemic and the role that data has played, because sometimes looking at the role data has played so far, what lessons learned, what best practice, what could we see in terms of what we need to think about going forward and our next steps. So I'm going to ask a broad opening question of all of you, and then hopefully that will spur a bit of a discussion, and then we can take it from there. But basically, from your point of views and from what you've seen and from your different viewpoints from industry and from working during the pandemic on data areas, where and how have you seen effective use of data during the pandemic? What's really stood out for you? What have you seen, or best practice or examples that really shone a light on the role data can play? Perhaps Haydn, let's kick off with you, if that's okay.
I think, I mean, the first thing to say is that we cannot in any way sort of underestimate some of the challenges that we've got here. I mean, for all of us, I'm sure we've worked in organizations where we're dealing with many disparate data sets within our own organization. And as soon as you start to try and put those data sets together, you immediately sort of run up very quickly against the problems around definition and connectivity and linkages. And that's in sort of small to medium-sized organizations of sort of 5,000 people. And you have a chief data officer, you've got a CTO, a COO. And then the challenge within an organization of trying to marshal data in a coherent way so you get insight is difficult. If you then extend that problem at a sort of a UK national perspective, and then you go a step further and you start to coordinate at a global perspective, it becomes incredibly difficult. Now, I think there's a very interesting political challenge here, and I think that this is something we can observe. It's not something that we would necessarily adopt, but I think that the directed countries. So if you look at places like South Korea, for example, and you look at the extent to which they sort of view data and the ability that they mandate change in a technical sense, I think that that ability to be able to say, we are going to do this and you are going to do it, albeit unacceptable to us, is actually something we can learn from. So I think there's segments here of the challenge that we have to sort of break out and say, this becomes a sort of a mandatory sort of requirement that we've got to pick up given what's at stake. So I think that's one learning, the sort of directed nature in the way that we have to respond to some of these challenges.
Interesting. Sarah, I suppose same question for you. What's really stood out for you in terms of the role data and data-driven infrastructure and technologies have played during the COVID? Before we look at what's the role going forward, it's important, right, to look at what we can take from where we've got to so far.
So I suppose the standout feature for me has been this mix of tech, data, and also human behavior. So we've seen this rapid adaptation and change to cope with the virus. And we've also seen some phenomenal examples of collaboration. So, for example, the one that struck me listening to one of those CBI webinars was the collaboration across the pharmaceutical, life sciences sectors, an intensely competitive sector, as we know. And that they had one of the senior people from Pfizer on one of their webinars talking about how they'd partnered with a small German pharma company and achieved in 6 weeks what would normally take 12 months. So that's tech data and human behavior. And then in terms of data, I suppose, there's the example of the NHS and government and supermarkets working together to identify and support vulnerable individuals. And then from a philanthropic perspective, you could say the Microsoft AI for Health program, set up actually before COVID, $60 million worth of investment for helping nonprofits, academia and governments with data dashboards and cloud computing resources to help them make better decisions and so on. And when COVID kicked in, they dedicated, I think, 20 million to help with treatment diagnostics resources and making sure information getting out there was accurate. And there are plenty of other examples, but there's this collaboration and speed with very rapid benefits that I think we've seen.
Yeah, indeed. There's some great statistics there in terms of the rate of digital acceleration and transformation we've seen in a matter of months compared to what would normally happen in a matter of years. But Ian, same question to you from your view and from Veritas's view. What have you seen that stood out for you in terms of where we've got to so far?
Yeah, I think I'll build on what Sarah said, and Sue, what you just touched on is the rate of transformation. That's what we've seen. You know, obviously we sit now not expecting the situation we're in right now. Most of us working from home, most of us have, strangely enough, adapted rapidly to do things very differently than what we did 6 months ago. But in that 6 months, what I've seen is a rapid transformation for digital projects that were perhaps on the back burner, that have been moved straight to the front. 2 reasons for that. Number one, their businesses have changed. They've had to accelerate their digitalization of what they do. And so those projects are brought to the forefront right now and have been for the last few months. And 2, the way they operate changes. If you think something super simple that I'm involved with, which is backup and recovery, that's an operational thing in IT where individuals would back up data to tape, normally back up everything forever. Who cares? Tape is cheap. But what we've seen is tape is no longer valid in the COVID situation, as you can't even get operations staff in and out of data centers. So that's been a forcing function for organizations to change the way they operate and change the way in which they back up and recover data. And that's now shining a light on respecting data better, classifying data, just in that very simple example. So the forcing functions of both the digital business transforming rapidly, but also the way in which IT operates transforming, that mix. We've never been busier before when, depending on where you work and what industry you're on, it could be challenging times. So the tech space has been a very, very busy time.
Absolutely, it's definitely been busy for a lot of organizations. Excuse me. Ben, same question to you. What's really stood out for you in terms of the role of data and maybe data infrastructure from your point of view?
So I think what stood out for me has been the acceptance of the government to look at science and to use data. Before COVID-19, data was given a quick, gloss over as, some scientist, and we remember people like Heinz Wolff and, Thomas Dolby and people like that, promoting science as being wacky. But now it's a foundation and a fundamental part of what we do. And understanding data, when you pick up a newspaper, a red top, and they're trying to describe in human terms what R means, then I think that's been a huge progress, especially for me, like Haydn as an engineer. Other things that have stood out, maybe not so positively, have been, the communication around data and what data means. So, for example, when we're talking about COVID-19 and we're talking about, and I hate to be so morbid, about deaths, or cases, the goalposts seem to be changing, and you only have to look at the US to see how data changes to better fit a political scenario. And it would be nice if some of that was removed and that we had within, that we had the chief scientists out explaining what the data is without being able to brush, because facts are facts, you know, whether you like it or not. Science is, you know, science. One of the things that we've been very busy with is looking at the importance of data, and this goes to what Ian said, is, you know, how do you make data available? More people want more data now. People distribute it away from home. So the infrastructure, I think it's, you know, it's creaking a bit. You know, I live in the countryside. Without wishing to sound like a whiner, I chose to live down here, but some of the infrastructure needs looking at, I feel. But standout has been the value of data, people's acceptance of the value of data and science, and the need for people to better understand it. But it is complex. It is hard for the people to understand. That is the fundamental problem.
Yeah, well, I'm sure we'll come on soon, Ben, to talk about infrastructure in terms of how do we get the next stage right if data is going to be and is really key to our recovery, and the next steps, how do we get that right? But interested, I kind of agree with you in terms of this crisis has really catapulted digital, definitely, but particularly data onto the minds of the average man and woman in the streets in terms of its impact. Would others agree? Is it, and that's got to be a good thing, right? That people are, do you think the society and people are getting the role of data, the value that data can play, not just in our economy, but in enabling their everyday lives and helping them in their everyday lives? Or is that what others are seeing? Because that's a good starting point to build on, right?
It's definitely a good starting point.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the eyes. Oh, sorry, Ian.
Sorry, Sarah. I was just quickly going to say, never before have I seen more people inquisitive about data. You know, I regard myself as a data geek, but now even my family, you know, we're on remote calls and discussing the death rates and what they mean, and there's more appetite to understand more about the data because of the impact, right? The impact is significant impact to their lives. And I think it raises the visibility of how important data is. So that's been a good thing, I think.
Yeah. And there's no data geeks here, Ian. Be proud. You're in good company. Sorry, Sarah.
I don't know. We could probably out-geek each other if we got time enough. So, I think, Sarah, you were going to say something, Sarah, I believe.
No, I was just going to echo what Sue and you all have been saying, and the recent ICO's annual survey report showed this increasing awareness amongst individuals around the significance of data and their rights in relation to it, and that can only be a good thing. And I think some of the matters we're going to come on to discuss will just show how important it is to engage with citizens and their representative bodies in the uses of data to get the trust that's so critical.
Absolutely. Haydn.
I was going to say, I think there's two interesting small exercises. We may not have the time to do this, but I think this is a kind of an indicator of the challenge that we're faced here. So I don't know how many people on the session have actually looked at the number of cookies that are actually installed on the various devices. So whether it's the phone or the laptop, and actually downloaded, you know, the cookies that are operational and that are tracking their behavior online. Next question, how many people have actually looked at you know, the number of organizations that Facebook shares your data with, interestingly. Okay, so those are two interesting exercises, and you can do both of those technically at home. And then the next question is, how many people have actually logged onto the government website to ask for a test, a COVID test, okay? And then there's this sort of experiential disparity that we seem very comfortable with sort of logging onto Facebook every day and sort of surfing the internet, but the experience of the sort of, you know, that government, we want this, we want that, you can see why people are reluctant to kind of offer up their information to the state, where at the other hand, you know, they're very sort of almost oblivious to the kind of the way these large organizations are actually tracking the data on a day-to-day basis. So there's a disparity there.
I think we're going to come on to talking a bit more about building trust and confidence in data use and how we get this right from not just obviously from a legal point of view, but from a societal point of view in a short while. But I just want to bring it back to maybe looking a bit more into the future now in terms of, okay, well, we've seen data's had a key role to play. We know that data has therefore got a key role to play in terms of what comes next in our recovery, in our rebuilding, and our reinvention. And I think that's very much a strong message that's coming through from the government on the national data strategy today, in terms of how the power of data and how we release that and really gain full value of the role data can play. So thinking about it from an organization's point of view, and we've, Ian, you talked a lot about digital transformation and acceleration. So before we talk about perhaps what are the key technologies, such as blockchain and others, of course, that could play a role here, how we've seen acceleration, we've seen organizations increase their digital transformation. So would we say that organizations, and this could be public and private, do they have the tools and technologies? Do they have what they need to really get to grips with and understand and then utilize their data and their data assets, particularly in terms of what happens next as they start to reopen, as they start to look at how do they recover perhaps the losses that they've faced during the COVID crisis? Do they have what they need? And if not, what do we need to be doing to help them?
Yeah, so there's work to be done. So every year we do a survey, we call it the Databerg survey. So think of this as a play on the iceberg concept, where we look at data composition, where below the surface is what we call dark data, and above the surface is clean data. If I actually looked at the recent results we had with the survey just published, and in public sector, they seem to do a little bit better than private sector, but in public sector, 30% of the data is above the surface, which is classified, and we can understand that it's live, active data, it's meaningful for public sector. In private sector, actually, interestingly enough, that's the biggest gap. Only 19% is above the surface. And then below the surface, 50% of the data below the surface is dark data. Dark means they actually don't know what it is. For any organization out there in both private sector and public sector, very similar statistics. The difference is actually something we call rot data, which is redundant, obsolete, and trivial data, which means it's data we know it's there, we kind of know what it is, but it's old, it's repeated throughout your networks, and it's trivial. We can recreate it very, very quickly. We don't really need to store it and protect it. And so anyway, the summary I have is that hasn't shifted in 5 years a huge amount. So I think organizations still have over 50% dark data. They still have a huge amount of data that don't know what it is. Most of that data sits in unstructured data sources. So that's normally in files or social media, in semi-structured type databases. It's not in the structured world where many people can have a good handle on that data to make value out of it. So I would say, to answer you, I think there's still a long way to go. Has that changed a huge amount with COVID? I think it's too early. I think it's really too early to tell, because I think it's going to start with changing culture. And culture is all about not being a data hoarder. A lot of people just store everything forever with a hope it'll be meaningful in the future. It'll start with appreciating clean data, good data, and storing that appropriately versus deleting data you don't need. I know a CDO in an event we did similar to this last year had a great view. He said what he wants to drive in his organization as a CDO is a culture that bad data is like litter on the floor, right? So people feel like they shouldn't just store something forever with no value that they can have in the future. And I think cultures take time. So I think it's early days for now, but it's a long answer to a question. I think there's still a long way to go for both private and public sector to get to the point where they value data and have valuable data and can use that effectively.
And interested in your thoughts on this, and particularly from whether it's this is something I kind of think about quite a lot, whether this is really a technology issue, is the infrastructure there, is the technology solutions there, or is it a cultural issue within organizations? What's your take on that?
Well, the answer is yes. So in a lot of instances, we've been approached by people who say, I've got all this data, tell me something. Well, tell you what? Well, what does the data tell me? Well, what do you want it to tell you? What are we looking for? Well, I don't know. I've got all this data. And unfortunately, that doesn't help. So culturally, you need to want to understand what are the requirements, what are you looking for, and once you have requirements that are measurable, then you can build technologies to deliver. So, I mean, it's an engineering thing. Haydn will back me up. You know, if somebody says, build me this, you know, it doesn't matter if they don't tell you how much it weighs, right? And they tell you it has to be, you know, reliable and solid and all these other things. You build an aeroplane out of solid titanium with no space for a pilot, right? And doesn't function. So you've got to have requirements. Looking at some of the technologies, and both Ian and Haydn mentioned this, is the data's unstructured. There's no what we call metadata. There's nothing that tells you what the data is, where it came from. And so understanding data context is very, very important so you can use it appropriately. You know, I've been to establishments where they would love 50% dark data, where it's 80% dark data. And when they do a dedupe, when they deduplicate, you know, they find 6 copies of The Dark Side of the Moon have been, you know, scanned into somebody's personal directory because they keep losing it. And so there's an awful lot of litter, and that's a perfect term. It's littered. But ironically, this does go back to the volume and the value of data, is that if you can keep every piece of data, every iteration of data change, then you can see thought processes, you can see people involved, and you can see work processes evolving. And if they're good, you can then infer and learn from that. But this is going to require technology that requires a lot more storage. And, you know, I'm sure that would make Ian very happy. It would make my salespeople very happy. So yes, you've got to know what you want to do with it. You've got to make sure that the data you have is effectively labeled and understood in context. And then that drives the technology of where you can build affordable large amounts of data storage.
We're definitely seeing a lot more conversations around data context, but also data quality as well, which is coming part of the conversation.
Garbage in is always garbage out.
Well, indeed. Sarah, before we come on to you, because I'd be interested in your view of how you see organizations and their expertise or their skills around data issues from your perspective. Just back to Haydn, and obviously from a kind of your take on this, do organizations have what they need, and particularly from the technologies themselves? You know, you're focusing very much on the work around blockchain. Are you finding people the uptake and the interest in emerging technologies to realize or to unlock the power of their data? What are you seeing?
I think there's a couple of things there. I think that the first is that, you know, having bought and sold technology, you know, in different roles, I have no doubt that there is plenty of technology out there that can support pretty much every kind of data need that you could conceive of, right? So there's all sorts of tools. There's loads of stuff, and it's all brilliant stuff. I think the challenge is what do you do with it, okay? And what do you do with it in the context of a properly governed organisation? And the way governance is such an important word, and I think it extends on, you know, what Ben was saying, talking about culture, because we've got all these tools and we've actually got all of this data. The challenge is governance, and it's effectively a control loop. I provide an input, I see an output, and then what I do is I take something from the output and I feed it back into my input, because, you know, it's either my output's either bigger or smaller than what I expected. It's a bit like getting into my electric vehicle. And then, you know, I want to see some nice clear dials. I want to see battery, and I want to see speed and distance traveled and time. But it's a bit like getting into my electric vehicle and finding there's boxes and boxes and boxes and boxes of paper that are giving me all of this data that apparently relates to my electric vehicle. And that's completely useless. So it's about organizing data in a way that's meaningful, that's provided on time, that can help you understand what you're doing. And you extend that, you take that from a simple example of a car, you apply it to an organization, and then you apply it to a country, you apply it to a global economy, and it becomes very, very difficult.
And it's a lovely segue to Sarah. Governance is the word here. I mean, if we're looking at, if organizations have the technologies, the expertise, the tools, I suppose, that they need to unlock the power of data and to use data, particularly in the recovery phase that we're moving within, do they have the skills from a governance, from a data protection, data privacy? What do you sense, or what do you see from organizations? Do they have what they need from this side?
Oh gosh, there's so much to unpack here, isn't there? Because businesses need to have a very clear strategy, and that's going to depend on where they are in terms of their maturity and the evolution, in terms of what they're trying to achieve. But in terms of skills and in terms of access to good quality data and good governance, these were flagged up in the recent Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation AI Barometer, for example, about skills being the biggest challenge to the adoption of AI. And of course, that's dependent on data by its very nature. And we're going to need turbocharging of investment in skills as part of the whole smoothing of job losses and so on. And one hopes that the government will put plenty of money into that. Yes, and in terms of good governance, this is absolutely at the heart of everything, isn't it? So we've seen this massive acceleration of adoption moving along the digital transformation journey, businesses trying to work out how to survive, what is their must-have technology out of emerging technologies to help them do that. And that's all really, really positive. But in this kind of race to progress, it's absolutely critical not to lose sight of this need to have security by design, privacy by design, ethics by design, built in as part of an overarching governance agenda. And that needs to go from the top of the business to the bottom of the business, end to end, in terms of any emerging technology and use of data. And people tend to say that, GDPR, oh, what a headache. But actually, you need to think about this regulation as a sword as well as a shield. It can really enable use of emerging technology, which we know gives productivity and economic benefits when one is further advanced than one's competitors. But you have to get this right at the start, or you will pay the price of it later on. So see it as an enabler, a competitive advantage, something that will mean that other businesses will want to work with you as a trusted partner, customer, provider, maybe a purchaser of your business. But it's absolutely a fundamental building block to being a trusted organization in this space.
And you touched on data security there and cybersecurity, and I think we'll come onto that in a minute. But we had a question in the chat around, it's not just about requirements, and perhaps a question is more around technical requirements, although apologies if I'm reading too much into this. Ultimately, it's about human behaviors we're trying to shape. And that's really important, right, Sarah? I always think of these as kind of, you've got processes and policies, you've got the role of technology, but then people, and people are always important. So how do we make sure, and this obviously to everybody, but to Sarah, it's getting the people behavior and the people approach to data right, as well as having all the requirements or the legal requirements in place, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And culture is always at the center of everything, isn't it? Communication is at the center of everything. And so you have to have leadership right at the top now. And we know that, for example, with artificial intelligence and the like, the Information Commissioner's Office is going to be looking to the very top of businesses, the C-suite, for responsibility around some of these areas. And so you have to have it baked in throughout. You have to have the training, the skills, the policies, the processes. And others can talk about cybersecurity too, but we know that there's a rise in cybersecurity issues and attacks, and behavioral weaknesses are just as much a vulnerability to that as technical processes.
I think we'll come back to the human behavior aspect in a little while, Sarah, because I'm keen to think about this from a societal point of view, not just an organizational point of view. How do we build data trust and confidence, or a culture of data trust and confidence going forward? But just to not move away from cyber security just yet, I suppose I'm interested in views around what we have seen around the online threat environment, and data has always been that target in this. So if we're going to say data has a more important role to play, data is going to be key to our recovery and to our economic and societal future. How do we make sure that we get that cyber security approach and strategy right? What are people seeing, or do people think organizations are getting that right? Maybe Ian, do you want to kick us off with that if you'd like?
Yeah, we are seeing a rise in things like ransomware attacks. So, sophistication of ransomware is increasing. No longer is it just to encrypt data to an end user consumer device to get some dollars. It's shifted to bigger organizations to get more dollars. It's no longer just getting money for unencrypting data so that you can carry on doing your business. It's shifting to use that type of technology to steal data for data loss and data theft. So there's a lot around ransomware. Now that is particularly challenging during COVID times. And the reason for that is data is moving from where it was in core protected data centers, in devices in office locations. Most people are working from home, and therefore the data is shifting into other devices, either locally on laptops or desktops, or in file sync and share cloud type devices. So the protection of the data is becoming even more something you need to consider in light on ransomware sophistication changing and attacks being higher. The conversations we have now, actually, interestingly enough, organizations, it's no longer just about protecting against ransomware. It's about recovery. So actually we shift from a cyber discussion around protection to a cyber discussion around resiliency and recovery. And I think that's the area that I've seen as a shift for COVID-19. And so more conversation around where data is, more conversations around recovering that data if it gets encrypted, but also protecting against loss of that data. So those are the areas I see in the current COVID challenges that we've got to consider is, and how long is it going to last? When do we go back into the office? When do we go back to data centers? And interestingly enough, I think that dynamic is yet to play out, but it's certainly a big threat for the customers I'm working with right now.
It's interesting. You obviously worked in industry for some time now, and cyber was an area I was very involved in, and talked about resilience for many years. But it's interesting you think that conversation has accelerated. It's really come to the fold during COVID. That's got to be a good thing, right?
Yeah, I think that is a good thing. It's a good thing that more people are focused on it. The challenge is it's become a different conversation that people didn't think they would cover. Most data centers are well protected. Most data centers have resiliency.
Yeah.
But now we're thinking resiliency of data that is stored in the edge.
Okay.
And I think that's where the shift is.
Yeah. Ben or Haydn, views on this? Maybe Ben?
Go on, Ben. Go on.
Okay, so I was going to say that Ian mentioned the edge, and the edge is really where we do computation, like on your phone, or as you gather data around cities. The data ultimately is being processed at the edge, and so you're not transferring raw data in and out of data centers. You're transferring information, because information is much more valuable. And irrespective of whatever you believe in fiber and 5G, the bandwidth isn't universal and it's not there everywhere. So the less data you move, the more information you move is important. But the trouble with information is that it's more useful than data, because information is a set of conclusions that you have come to, thus making access to that more valuable to industrial spies, foreign powers, things of that nature. Yes, data centers are protected. It's very hard to go near a data center, and tap into the lines, but it's a lot easier to get into, it's a lot easier to do man-in-the-middle attacks on information that's being passed around. And so, yes, we are going to have to start thinking about that a lot more. On the news this morning, there was an article from the banks that has said in COVID-19, they have rescued something like £96 million worth of fraudulent cash, where people have actually been tricked to going to their banks to get cash out.
Wow.
To pay for scams. So they're getting, it's much easier for people to not trust electronic transfer, but the same people are being socially engineered to go to their banks to get money out. And so that was the news this morning. And I thought, well, that's something I'd never even thought about, that data security now ends up at a bank teller who looks and sees somebody whose story doesn't ring true. Not that the person isn't trustworthy, but the story behind the request for money is not trustworthy and has actually acted as an agent there. So, and you wonder how many of these, haven't happened. You wonder how many of these are just a function of just going to the hole in the wall and taking out money. So that was, we've got the challenges there of not just the data centers, but the fact that it's now transferring information rather than data, which is more valuable. And where do you step in and respond to these effectively cyber threats?
Fascinating. Haydn, love your thoughts on this as well. And also we got a question in the chat around the scaling and perhaps reluctance of business leaders to take DLT, I presume distributed ledger technologies, projects to scale. So I don't know if is something you could touch on as well. Perhaps it's a question in the chat.
I'll pick up on the cyber one very briefly. I mean, it's been interesting in my career, so I've seen a transition. If you compare cyber to health and safety, for example, so in my career, I've seen a sort of transition whereby health and safety was something that there was a department down the corridor that used to have responsibility, whereas now it's very much a hygiene factor, so that we're all responsible for health and safety. The last 6 months, my wife works at one of the other big consulting companies, so she's head of inclusion diversity there. Her big focus over the last 6 months has been around response to all of the different events that have happened. So equality, diversity for individual, and actually that's so important. And actually we need to take that kind of hygiene factor for the person, and we need to apply it in the same way to principles as it relates to data and cyber security, because we're all responsible. We're all ultimately responsible, and it's incumbent upon us to understand it. So incredibly important. So I think the question in the chat, so why is the reluctance of business leaders to take DLT projects to scale? Provenance, fault tolerance, security, DID are being addressed and changed in the way that data is managed and leveraged. I think that I think the headline observation there is, so we're seeing lots of interest as it relates to provenance and traceability of goods in the supply chain. I think that the challenge over the last, and more so than ever, I would say, I mean, having been in this space now for over 6 years in various forms and, full-time basis for the last 3 years, I would say the last 6 months, more interest and traction than ever in terms of, working through some of the opportunities we've got there. I think that where the crunch point comes, the last 6 months has been about response, tactical responses, in terms of immediate survival, navigating, the economic stresses that we face. I think over the next sort of 12 to 18 months, what we'll begin to see is a sort of a reassessment internally in terms of strategies, in terms of how we can connect organizations using DLT as a technology, and then apply it both in a supply chain context, but also in a technology context. So I'm confident that that is coming through. It's just going to take time for it to happen.
Great, thanks, Haydn. So I thought I heard someone coming in. It's just a gremlin. So we've focused very much on organizations and how organizations can really get to grips with and realize the power of their data. But we mustn't forget, and we've touched on this, gently throughout, but the importance of bringing the whole of our society and economy, but all of the society with us on this journey as well. How do we, if we're going to realize the power of data, and very much so in all these different areas, we can only do that if we've got people with us on this journey, right? Particularly from a trust, confidence point of view. And we at techUK obviously see that's really important, particularly with emerging technologies like artificial intelligence. So how do we get it ethically right? How do we do that? But more broadly around data, you know, we get very excited about the role data can play in data technologies. It's very exciting to a lot of it, but there's also concerns, right? And also some really big fundamental issues that we need to address, particularly around trust and confidence of data and data-driven tools and technologies, or data-driven decision-making and what it can mean to people's lives. Sarah, maybe coming to you first and then be keen to hear others' views. How do we get people with us on this journey? How important is it building trust and confidence in data, particularly for what we want to be doing going forward? And are we getting this right?
It's absolutely critical. And the watchwords, of course, are about transparency and accountability, and where possible, as much stakeholder engagement as possible. I heard a chap on giving a talk the other day who's responsible for building the app for the test and trace in Ireland and Scotland. And I mean, I don't know how it's going to pan out, but it sounded as though they'd gone about that in exactly the right way to get the trust and confidence of the public. So, for example, they'd open sourced everything. They'd engaged with all the privacy groups. They'd got celebrities to talk about their confidence in the app. They had done all sorts of sort of simple videos to show exactly how it works. So they'd gone about it in a transparent way, demonstrating how they were accountable for it, getting other tech providers to comment on the source code and how it had been developed and so on. And that's the kind of thing that can help foster trust. And just in the same way, a sort of pet topic of mine is this whole data sharing and fostering data sharing. We've talked a lot about cleaning up our own data and dark data and so on, but the real solution to all of this is aggregating and sharing data. And there's really exciting work going on, as you'll know, around the whole data stewardships and data trusts, started by Wendy Hall and others a few years ago, that led to those ODI pilot data trusts. And building on that, there's now a new project that Wendy Hall is behind with the Ada Lovelace and the ODI and the AI Council. We were involved in the pilots and this subsequent project, about how you can bring together institutions and stakeholders, including citizens, to share data around a common purpose in a trusted way, for broader benefits than perhaps necessarily immediate commercial benefits of any particular individual group. And that is really exciting work to be watched. And I think there's a lot of interest across a lot of sectors on seeing how businesses who perhaps haven't worked together before, or in a very competitive environment, can come together around a common purpose and share data, and the scope for privacy enhancing technology and other things to help add trust to that. So whether it's citizen engagement or projects to bring businesses together to share data, there's a lot of momentum now that we can build on, but trust comes from transparency, accountability, and stakeholder engagement.
Indeed. Thank you, Sarah. Others' views on this? I think be interested to get others' views in terms of, are we getting this right, or what more we may need to do to get this right? Ben, did you want to come in? Yeah.
It's not just trust. People have got to see value in it.
Yep.
You know, if you don't see value in what's being done, then you wonder why they're doing it, why they're spending the money. So that instantly breeds either resentment or a lack of, perceived value. So if you don't value what's being done, then it doesn't matter how many times you peer review it. And of course, we all know if 4 academics peer review a single paper, there's 5 opinions. I can say that as an ex-academic. So no value, no trust. And this goes back to what you were saying, somebody was saying about, Facebook. I think it was Haydn, is that, we value, personally, I don't, I value Twitter. But if you value Facebook and you value Google search engine, then you will find that your private life is littered with cookies and giving data away. If you don't value something, then it doesn't matter. If it's of no value to you, and in a lot of instances like the doomed original track and trace app, irrespective of the technical flaws, it didn't have the pickup, it didn't have the initial amount of people wanting it. And why didn't people value that? And if they didn't value it, was it because they didn't trust it, or didn't they value it? So you've got those two conundrums as well.
I think it's a really good observation. They most trusted the international organizations more than the government. I think there's something in that, and I think that's where it led to. And therefore, every day we are making value risk decisions just constantly. And for some reason, with track and trace, the risk, which I think was underlying lack of trust, just came. We lost the value. We lost surely it's valuable to have track and trace. I mean, we lost the value conversation. We just focused overwhelmingly on the risk conversation, which I think was a significant break of trust, and ultimately says a lot if individuals are willing to trust large international organizations over the UK government.
I think it's, I've said this a couple of times, but it's a very difficult problem. I think, you can sort of summarize it by saying it's down to my relationship with the state as it relates to data. And if you compare it to other types of relationships, so I have a clear relationship with the state as it relates to my driving license, for example. Okay, it's very clearly communicated. I know what I can drive, and I know the speed that I can drive at, and I know that I have to pass a test, and I know how long I'm allowed to drive based on that test. Now, that whole package of understanding is very clear. Okay. And it's almost as I'm not saying people have to have data licenses or anything like that, but I think we've got to create an environment where people understand their relationship with the state as it relates to data that is important, okay, and what's important to them, and also recognise that there is this ocean of other data that's out there that people are doing things with that actually we're not going to be able to keep track of. So you almost want to just kind of locate a core set of data and then define and then make it very clear to the individual that that's how we expect you to work with, treat, manage, have custody of your data, so that you can have a healthy and fair and private relationship with the state.
I think, Haydn, you're absolutely right in terms of there's no single answer to this. It's not wanting to use the analogy of a silver bullet, but it's a very complex issue, right? It's a very complex discussion, but it's an important one to get right, of course, and that's something that we'll be working on going forward with, particularly the consultation around the National Data Strategy. Trust, confidence, fairness, transparency, from what I've seen, Sarah, is all captured within the strategy. So, okay, well, how do we then turbocharge or supercharge that work and really make it the heart of the National Data Strategy and the approach that the UK is going to be taking go forward? So we bring everybody with us on this journey. I think it's so vital and it's so important to get that right.
No,
but
we have to remember there are ISO standards on data management. 2700, people talk about 9000 for work processes, but there are international standards for data management. And if you do certain projects with certain government departments, it's mandatory that your organization has this data. But how relevant is the standard now? How old is it? Does it need reviewing? And those, without seeing the strategy, it would be interesting to see if those standards are being, up-leveled, given that this is an international standard that's been around for a long time. How does that cope with the new mechanisms of AI, massive convergence of edge to data centers to cloud? I don't believe it touches on modern technology. So
Well, but there's a wealth of guidance out there, Ben. I mean, wealth of guidance, world-class guidance from the ICO, the Alan Turing Institute, some of the international organizations. Well, regulation is, so anything to do with GDPR, of course, is, but you know, that leads to ethics and so on. But there is fantastic guidance out there that if people follow, they can do this in a way that's trusted.
But absolutely, I think that what I'd take from that is we are definitely not starting from scratch, right? There's a lot of good stuff out there. It's just how do we make sure it's fit for purpose and it helps to reflect the role of data and the way people are using data perhaps today, and to think about our topic, particularly as we move forward into the post-COVID recovery. I'm afraid, and there's so much more we could talk about, that we are running out of time quickly. With 2 minutes left before the hour. I can't believe it's gone so quickly. So I just wanted to round this up with just perhaps a quick fire question to all of you to finish off, which is going to be horrible. And I hate it when chairs do this, so apologies in advance. But I think, 30 seconds from each in terms of what is if you're thinking about data is driving our post-COVID recovery, that's what we're talking about here, the real potential, and how do we get this right? What to you is important? What one, if you can get two in 30 seconds, I'll allow it, but what one or two things do you think is important to really focus on to make sure that we are transforming the UK as we look at our post-COVID future into that real data-driven economy and society? Ian, let's start with you, and then I'll work back.
I'm going to squeeze in three things really quickly.
Okay,
it's about people, process, and technology. I think those are the three things I'm going to squeeze in. Educate your people, understand your process, and be inquisitive about technology to help you manage your data more effectively.
Great, well done, Ian. Ben?
I was going to say that we have to do a better job of communicating. If you cannot clearly describe in one sentence what you are gathering the data for and why it is of benefit to you, then you shouldn't bother. You should not have to read 40 pages of terms and conditions. It must be clear, you must understand it, and you must understand the value.
Great, Ben. Sarah?
Oh gosh, it's a great opportunity for the tech sector to shine in the economic recovery and play a part in this 800 billion or so fully functioning data economy can bring. But let's keep this momentum and the rapid progress, but not lose sight of strong governance. We can't afford to lose public trust if we're going to maximise the benefit for recovery through tech.
Great, thanks, Sarah. And Haydn, last word to you.
Yeah, so we're all familiar with disaster recovery and black start tests, where we, subject the building we disconnect the power. Well, actually, what we should do, we should be exposing organisations to shock events and then asking them to use their data to recover from that. So it's a rehearsal. So we've got to rehearse the way in which we use data and actually test our data frameworks to ensure that they're actually equipped to respond for these future shock events.
Great. Wow. Well, look, that has been fascinating, and we have unfortunately come to the end of our time. Haydn, Ben, Ian, and Sarah, thank you so much for all your insights and for bringing so much experience and wisdom to what is a topic I am sure we'll continue to talk about at techUK, but across, of course, the whole of the industry, not just as we look to get into the devil of the detail of the national data strategy, but also look at responding to it. As I mentioned, it is a consultation, which is great. So we'll be working on that. If you want to get involved, please do reach out to myself or any of the techUK team. But with that, I will say thank you, a huge thank you to all our panelists, for everybody for joining us today. I wish you a wonderful rest of your Wednesday, and see you again very soon, I'm sure. Thank you very much, everybody. Bye-bye.